Welcome to the Enlight.Life podcast with Alexandra Cousins. Together we'll demystify disease and the debates around health, empowering you toward real regeneration and a life of vibrant vitality.
So welcome everyone. Here we are at the Enlight.Life podcast. I'm your host, Alexandra Cousins, and I'm here with Justin Maguire. Now, as so often when I call guests upon my show, I don't even know who they are myself. And I simply hear of them, hear about them, and or I get a strong calling because maybe I read something about them that says, I need to have this person on my show. And so with Justin, I have heard about him through different people probably a year ago. And it was just this message of like, oh my gosh, you have to meet Justin. You have to talk to Justin. He is a wealth of knowledge and wisdom and all the things. And we kind of chatted a little bit here and there, but never really spoke. And so I reached out to him recently and I said, why don't you come onto my podcast and let's have a chat on the podcast live. So here we are. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you, Alexandra. It's great to be here. Before we got on to recording, you had asked whether or not you want to introduce me or whether I should introduce myself. We went with the latter choice. I'm a hedonist turned healer. So forget about all the qualifications, which I have plenty of, and all the associations, which I have an abundance of as well. The core and the motivation as to why I do what I do is because I myself have gone through many a moment in the dark night of the soul and the shadow moments, and had to come to grips in terms with aspects of my own self toward an opportunity to birth a new identity, a new ego. And this is something that we were also briefly mentioning before we started recording, the idea behind ego and how it's construed. And I believe a lot of your audience, given the fact that they are involved in self-development and along with that spiritual development as well, may have a good understanding that when I speak about ego, I'm not speaking about narcissism, but rather the broad definition of an element of energy, should we say emotion, that allows us to feel safe. And we can really encourage and nurture our egos to be constructive or destructive. And I've gone through both moments. Through a whole multitude of worldly events, from addiction to abuse and everything else in between, both of that which was inflicted on me and what I've inflicted on others. And no, I've never raised my hand to anybody before anybody asks. But there are other forms of abuse that we unfortunately, inadvertently inflict on others without even realizing we're doing so, particularly when we're caught up in not being self-aware, which I am guilty of having done so in my past. So along my journey, I went into a hedonistic lifestyle to try to avoid what was pressing on me. Suffice to say, through that, I went into a crumbled mess, which was wonderful, absolutely wonderful, because there was nowhere else to turn but inward. And through that experience, I birthed the business that I now run alongside many others that contribute towards its success, and graciously and gratefully have been gifted the opportunity to direct its purpose. So that's me in a nutshell.
Wonderful. I like that that introduction because it's to me it speaks of someone who truly has become fully human, right? Or is, I mean, are we ever? We're always on this journey, but
I love that point. Or can I add into that? I love that you bring this up. And I said before we went on the call that Providence has set everything in motion as and when it should be. Because you and I were meant to have had a call months ago, and yet life wonderfully didn't get in the way, but enabled us to be in our path to eventually converge. And from what you're mentioning is actually there's a new concept that we're birthing at the moment. It's still in its infancy. It's called mitochondrial psychology. And it's the merger between spiritual conceptualization of awakening and Professor Navier's work behind the cell danger response in the mitochondria. It's quite extraordinary. I'm not going to go into too much detail because it is quite new and fresh, and we need to piece things together to make it more eloquent. But nonetheless, I love that about consciousness and awareness, and how we never are in a constant and continual state of awareness. I think the idea of enlightenment, even Buddha itself, let's not say himself, itself, because I believe that all the past, should we say, sages, teachers that have ever been, they're actually more of a depiction of energy than necessarily an actual person. Not to say that there wasn't the actuality of the person, but even going back to what Buddha said, the middle way is best. And in the middle way, one realizes that epiphany affords itself in the moment, but it does not mean that one is in a continual state of epiphany. So although we have moments where we are awakened, we go through the 4 stages of awakening continually. And those are, first, the victim identity, which we all get born into for the purpose of survival. As a baby, if you don't cry, you don't get attention to be fed, and you don't survive. So you very quickly learn victim identity. But as you grow older and you become more self-sufficient, you become empowered. And then through there, you need to let go of your ego to be willing to be open to learn new things. Otherwise, you just be able to walk and eat and not understand languages and mathematics and everything else. And then that comes into the process of surrender. And only when you truly let go of everything that you thought you knew to be true, can you be open to everything else that could be possible. And that's where we are as a species. We're on the cusp of allowing ourselves to disintegrate what our framework is in order to afford a new opportunity. And I really love that. What you mentioned is that, we never have continual moments of just wisdom, and thankfully, because otherwise life would be morbidly depressing, right? I'm grateful for my idiotic moments because they afford opportunity.
Absolutely. So yeah, and in many ways, I'm all about, how can we just be human? Because already that feels like a feat these days. These days where everyone wants to be somebody, and these ideas of perfection, whether looking a certain way or all these. It's like, no, for me the real journey is about, and health is so intimately connected to how deeply human can you be. That for me is everything. At least that's been on my path the biggest learning of, can I just fully accept me as a human being having this experience? And, can I be fully present in every single moment, no matter what I'm going through? Can I still be present to the experience? And that's kind of, that's sort of where I have arrived.
I love that, the idea behind presence. And, I'm so grateful that you had the capacity, which so few people do in the day and age we live in, to pause, hear what the other person is saying. This type of exchange is so warranted, because you go and you listen to other podcasts. This is, if we talk about podcasts, since we're on one, you listen to other podcasts, and it almost sounds like artillery fire that's occurring between the two people, because everybody wants to be heard, but nobody wants to listen.
Absolutely, yeah, and everyone wants to look like they are the ones who know. And yeah, it's like, can we have, so yes, I always welcome beautiful sincere conversations. So I mean, let me tell you what I heard about Justin, right?
Go for it.
What did I hear about Justin? So I heard Justin has incredible knowledge around peptides and all things cutting edge health. And I come, and that's always to me very interesting, because I come from a very purist background. So when my health fell apart, I dove deep into fasting. And when I say deep, I mean deep. I did 7 rounds of between 40 to 53 days of fasting, dry fasting, the colon cleansing, all the things, raw foods, and literally until I almost dissolved my whole being. And I was kind of like hanging up in the clouds. And my husband was like, Alex, we have kids that we need to feed. So maybe it's time to come down from the clouds and from your enlightened state and just kind of, deal with reality. And so from this pure state, which served a purpose, it definitely did, but then I had to re-enter sort of, being a living being amongst, everyone else. And that's actually what I found peptides. And for me, more than peptides, peptide bioregulators specifically, they really helped me to sort of put together my very fragile endocrine system. And that's when I realized, okay, so yes, we can be purists and, fasting and herbs and all of that is wonderful, but sometimes we also need cutting edge science. And it was a great epiphany, because something healed for me, actually, to go, I don't need to fear science. I don't need to fear medicine.
Right.
There's a purpose, right? And there is goodness in all, but we need to be able to use it.
Correct. And I think the epiphany is more powerful than the peptides. Myself,
Yes.
I was on the opposite end of the spectrum for the better part of 15 years. Before I went into this life, I was competitive in bodybuilding. I took a plethora of steroids, like a lot of steroids, enough to kill a horse during that time in my life. And I was always like against, the woo sciences of homeopathy and botanicals and Chinese medicine. And yet it was through, similar to you, my shift of mindset, that the subtlety and the gentle nature of these modalities actually allowed me to start healing, because I had been pushing so hard for so long. And the difference is it's the intensity of the masculine or feminine energy behind different modalities, and both are warranted at different times. And when you can really understand, and that's not to say that homeopathy is just a feminine, it really isn't. You have aspects within itself that are more masculine and more feminine. But when we look at categorical differences, one could say that there's more of a push with pharmacological remedy than there's a homeopathic remedy in terms of the acute reactions that they may have. But it doesn't mean that one is bad and the other one is good. It's quite apart from the point. It means that one really needs to truly understand presence, which you mentioned before. Presence is the most important thing. When you're present in what the body requires wholly, not just from the objectivity of quantitative diagnostics, but you're wholly present as to what signs and symptoms have correlation to not only the physiological being, but the psycho-emotional being, as well as the spiritual emotional being as well. That's when you can truly start to harness the conceptualization as to what kind of feminine or masculine energies can be incorporated into your efforts. Deprivation comes in many different forms. And, it's not uncommon for us to go through periods of self-flagellation, which we perceive in the moment as a hero's journey. I went through it when I was competing. Often we would get our body fat levels down to ridiculously low, unhealthy levels. Friends of mine passed out on stages many a time from using diuretics and everything else, in addition to having low body fat levels. So when it comes to the extremes of deprivation, I'm very familiar with it. And it's not too different from fasting for extended periods of time. Now, it's not to say that these things are always bad for you, but it's important to know that once you've passed a grade in school and you've got your certification, why are you going back and redoing the grade over and over and over again? There are certain things to learn, and there are certain things to leave behind. And this is where, experience affords the opportunity of wisdom, and it's important to hold on to that, not to let it go. So yes, I think the difference of modalities in understanding wisdom can be very powerful.
Yeah, I like what you're saying, and it's, I would say again, it's rare to be able to find people with whom one can have sort of the full conversation, because most people are become dedicated and sort of evangelical about one path. So whether that is right, you find healing through raw food, so now everyone should be a raw foodist,
I love that.
or through fasting, and no matter what it is, right? And it's the stories of like the vegans who become carnivores, and now all of a sudden veganism is the devil and carnivorism is the savior.
I know it's hilarious, isn't
or
it?
the, or the other way around. Yeah. and
Yeah.
and that's where I have to sort of like, I don't know, praise myself and honor myself to go, thank goodness, by the grace of God, I had enough wisdom not to do that.
Good. Thank you.
Because I feel it's the easiest thing to do, right? I mean, it is the easiest thing to do, to get married to one way of looking at life and at health, when really we need to be able to look at the whole spectrum. And I love what you said, what is appropriate basically when, for what energy, and then maybe you're done with that because now there's something else to basically master and to gain wisdom from and to embody.
Absolutely. And I think also understanding where that moment comes into fruition, one really needs to separate oneself from the masses and the propaganda that most of us aren't even aware of, that we're absorbing. There's a book by a gentleman named Joost Muller. It's an old book written in the 50s, right after the Second World War, and it's entitled The Rape of the Mind. It's a fantastic book, and it talks about the Pavlovian experiment. For those who are not familiar, it's an experiment where they conducted ringing a bell in times where they fed dogs, and then outside, after a while, once the dogs became accustomed to the bell being the associate to food, they would not have the food present but still ring the bell, and lo and behold, the dogs would still salivate. So this whole thought experiment was actually implemented in mass propaganda throughout history, particularly in Nazi Germany, which is what the book was, but it hasn't stopped. Don't think that this is still not going on. It very much so is. And even if something, I think even more so, if something isn't apparently or blatantly obscene, like racism, but is discreet and has the appearance of being rather holy, one really needs to err caution. Okay, because the dogmatic ideology of somebody else's concepts can easily be adopted without a person even realizing that it's not even their own. Okay, so the manipulation of psychology to the collective, of which you are spending the most amount of time, can really influence what you know to be true, right, or what you perceive to be true. And this is why, like, what you mentioned before, you have your vegan clicks and you got your carnivore clicks. This is stay on that topic because it is a valid topic, and they have their emotive reasons, their spiritual reasons, and everything in between, the physiological reasoning, all those things. And, one can give enough reasons to anything if there's enough emotional motivation to a cause, right? I mean, talking about the Nazis, they gave enough reason to gas 6 million Jews because there was enough reason to their so-called quote-unquote cause. Now, it might be an extreme comparison. People would say, how can you compare that to veganism or carnivorism, if there is a word? Well, you might not be killing anybody, and you might not be stealing their goods, but what a part of yourself are you depriving? And in essence, what part of yourself are you murdering in that process of deprivation? The reality is that there is no clear defined path that should be in place in a continuity throughout one's entire life, but rather that there are seasons as to when something has value. Veganism, for example, works extremely well in cases such as fatty liver, non-alcoholic fatty liver, which can be instigated not only through poor lifestyle, but also a certain type of infection.
Yeah.
Right? Tumor cell cancers, where veganism can work really well initially to support that. But then again, carnivorism, or the carnivore diet, I don't know if carnivorism is not a weird word, but the carnivore diet really works well for mast cell activation syndrome, helps to reduce the histamine response, having anti-nutrients. So those who have deficiency in phenyl sulfotransferase, as an enzyme to break down phenols in plants, would do well on a meat-based diet for a particular period of time. Not for the inevitable period of time, but for a particular period. So everything has its place, but also consideration needs to come into effect. How does this not only affect my body, but how does this affect my values and beliefs? Can I ask you to give me 1 second? I was going to put the computer on charge because the battery's going to die. Give me 2 seconds. Sorry. There we go. Okay. Back in business. Cool.
Oh, good. We can cut that piece out.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, there's a season for everything, and and as one of my teachers always said, therapeutics do not equal lifestyle, right? So whatever is working for a therapeutic reason for a time, which sometimes we know when we have a severe accident and we have to go into rehabilitation, sometimes that rehabilitation takes 2 years, 3 years.
Right.
But then when we end the rehabilitation, we don't still do the same exercises that we were doing to get rehabilitated. And
Correct.
to me, it's the same concept with diet or fasting or even supplementation for that matter.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree with you. It should be periodic, and it should be clearly defined as to the objective through its use, without a doubt. It's important to not just take something for the nicety of it, but rather for the clear, defined purpose. Yeah, no, I believe that that's something that people aren't wholly taking into consideration. Again, coming back to the influence that media has on something being portrayed as being good for a particular type of system. Let's talk about NMN or NAD.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This is a very clear example of this. NAD being touted to be useful for Alzheimer's disease, for alcoholism, for mitochondrial diseases, and so on. And rightfully so, it's a nucleotide that helps the replication of mitochondrial DNA. Okay, so apart from it being a catalyst to electron transport for the electron transport chain, it is a big catalyst as a nucleic acid for DNA expression in order to produce more mitochondria. However, that's not all it does, right? NAD is a big fueling aid for macrophage, okay, for parts of the innate immune system. Now, if there's dysregulation occurring in the immune system, as in a Th2 dominant state of the immune system, and you don't forward everything in order to regulate that Th2 dominance into a neutral adaptive response, then putting in that NAD is only going to create more inflammation. It's going to fuel those macrophages to start instigating an increased release of cytokines such as tumor necrosis factor, and then you start having rheumatic disorders come into fruition. So the exact same molecule that's meant to prevent autoimmunity and neurodegeneration can actually fuel and accelerate it if it's used in the wrong context. And this is where we have to be very vigilant, because just because something isn't requiring a script or is not scripted does not mean that it doesn't come without any due consideration to its use.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned NAD plus in particular, because so many people, right? Like we hear from the biohacking world, NAD. And I think also because it's expensive, there's this idea like, we should just all pump it because, it's expensive.
Yeah.
There's this crazy idea.
What's good for you?
Yeah, it's expensive. It must be great. But I've seen the damage that NAD can do, and I've had clients that came to me from functional medicine practitioners that were giving them weekly NAD. Which of course also it's a nice boost for income. In the States it's about $1,000 a pop, and these people were just completely finished off. Besides what you're mentioning, I think also when adrenals are particularly down and you are just pumping the body with something that is kind of, basically a stimulant, the adrenals can't cope. So there's a momentary stimulation and then a crash.
No, either to add further weight to what you're mentioning as well, NAD is only as useful as the balance to NADH. and NADP to NADPH, right? So when we understand what are catalysts to energy release, as well as what are catalysts to antioxidant regulation, this is when we look into nucleotides like NAD or FAD, which is very rarely spoken about, which in my opinion, given the heightened exposure to artificial light, such as what we're doing right now, looking into a computer screen, is far more imperative to look into means to regulate than that of NAD expression on its own in the singularity. The thyroidoxin system is not fully supported in the day and age which we're living in. And I would, any day of the week, bet money on the fact that people are more in the requirement of riboflavin and other compounds such as diazoflavin to regulate their autonomic state and giving them more and more NAD. But again, going back to the point about NADH, if the mitochondria aren't able to utilize T3, this whole process of not only NAD production but NADH regulation and the subsequent reduction of oxidized glutathione into reduced forms of glutathione doesn't take precedent, right? So, and this would lead into what you mentioned about adrenals not having the efficacy, because without T3, your hypothalamus, definitely not hippocampus, the hypothalamus would not regulate its precursor release of ACH to create the release of ACTH, which is a precursor hormone to the production of cortisol, glucocorticoids. So you need enough T3 to create the release of ACTH from the pituitary. Without T3, this doesn't take place effectively. And at what time of the day does the release of ACTH predominantly occur? Actually in the evening hours while you're in deep wave sleep. So this is something that people really need to take on board. If you're having compromised sleep and you're waking up frequently throughout the evening hours, it has been traditionally referred to or associated to liver compromise from Chinese medicine to naturopathy and so on. And they're not too far off. The liver can become stressed because it will heighten its modification rates as well as methylation rates to afford support to catecholamine due to an insufficient metabolic hormone activity in the regulation of glucose, which what thyroid plays a huge role in. So if you're waking up frequently throughout the evening, it is actually a form of reactive hypoglycemia occurring. But why is it occurring? Yeah. And in situations such as cellular thyroid resistance, which is very different from hypothyroidism, which people know it to be, taking NAD can really make things a lot worse, because the only thing that you're doing in that situation is creating a further imbalance to oxidation and reduction, leading the body into a compensatory mechanism of putting more strain on the adrenals to the point where glucocorticoid release becomes insufficient and then catecholamine release becomes more prevalent, which is obviously a distortion as to how the body should work. Catecholamine should be released in a moment, glucocorticoids more on a continual basis to continue the fuel demand required from the body. But without enough T3, the sensitivity of glucocorticoids reduces. So what happens initially is the body compensates to release more than it should to the point of exhaustion, and catecholamines get released. And this is where you get the wired but tired sensation, because that's what catecholamines do, particularly norepinephrine. So NAD, just on one topic alone, really needs the utmost consideration into the state and health of the mitochondria, and which is not just afforded by the hormonal state of such as thyroid, but actually the whole state of the immune system. Anybody that is given a clinical process or protocol with NAD, and I'm talking about like smaller doses of NAD can have their benefit, and there's less like it's like anything, right? It's, the dose can determine the toxicity or the healing opportunity, right? Mm-hmm. It's the quantity of the poison. I think Paracelsus mentioned this as well back in the 1500s. But it's not just about the hormones, it's about the immune system. And anybody that's given a high dose NAD protocol without the clinician, whether it's a doctor or otherwise, measuring lymphocyte flow cytometry and cytokine mapping prior to giving them a very expensive protocol to support whatever pathological process is playing out, I think are not fulfilling due diligence, are actually doing it through haphazard means. One
Yeah.
truly needs to understand what is going on within the immune system and subsequently that effect on the mitochondria before fueling more nucleic acid donation.
Mm. Yeah, and this is something that I feel most doctors just completely ignore and bypass. And in some ways, similarly to another sort of very popular prescription is, let's just do glutathione IVs. Just shoot the glutathione because, and I think it's because a lot of the doctors, they get taught again by, I don't know, whoever the producers of these compounds,
Mm.
and they don't really go through sort of a rigorous training on, or even understanding of what happens in the endocrine system. I mean, no one ever, who talks about the hypothalamus? No one really talks about the hypothalamus. No one talks about the pituitary gland. No one really talks about the pineal gland. I mean, pineal maybe a little bit, but we don't really talk about the upper endocrine system.
Even with the pineal gland, very few people even realize that it's located outside the blood-brain barrier and what implications that has on endocrine health. Due to the fact that the pineal gland is located out, and this comes back to topics of melatonin, right? And I often, in certain scenario of immune compromise, it phase at the right timing would introduce melatonin as high as sometimes 1,600 milligrams a night. You heard right, 1,600 milligrams.
Wow.
Right. And there's been cases through other doctors that I work alongside that go much higher than that, 10 times that.
Wow.
Okay. Cancer, for particular types of cancer.
Yeah.
Now, the question I get asked, so the 1,600 milligrams is not a frequent, I've only done that twice, but a frequent of mine, and a lot of immune compromised cases, 200 to 400 milligrams. The question I get asked is, will this not shut down my own capacity and production of melatonin?
Yeah.
Because of the way in which the location as to where the pineal is located outside the blood-brain barrier, it is the exact reason as to why the feedback loop doesn't shut down its production. You see, the pituitary and the hypothalamus are located inside the blood-brain barrier. So if you were to give the body testosterone or estrogen, for example, depending on the quantity, it can create a shutdown in that feedback loop in order to protect the body. But melatonin is very different. Melatonin, you can take super physiological levels. And one of the reasons as to why, it's not just a hormone. It's actually far from just a hormone. There are actually 400 times more melatonin receptors in the gut than there are in the brain. It is one of the most immunoactive molecules in the human body. And which is quite interesting because any psychonauts out there that have ever experienced any form of 5-MeO DMT or ayahuasca or anything else like that will know the power that, if utilized and implemented correctly, that these quote-unquote ceremonial process can facilitate. In terms of regeneration. And again, both are produced from the pineal that are located outside the blood-brain barrier. I don't think nature afforded this design by fluke or by chance. I think there's rationale to its reasons. But again, it also needs to be applied in the right context and also in the right circumstance. Because when we talk about DMT, for example, it is an amazing molecule to instigate neuroplasticity and the regeneration of nerves. However, if it's used too frequently, and I'm mentioning this because I had conversation with many an explorer of self when they go through a period, they call it a protocol, where they'll smoke DMT, not take that because it's obviously a quicker and a shorter time frame. They'll do it 5 days a week for 3 weeks straight. Now, just for anybody who's considering doing that, just a little bit of food for thought. One of the reasons why autistics have the pathological expression that they have is because autistics are actually well known to release more DMT than the average human being, but they have incapacity to regulate the production of melatonin. So what happens is you get aberrant neuroplasticity. So just because you have the neuroplasticity doesn't necessarily mean it's occurring in the right parts of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
How do we manage that it occurs in the right parts of the brain? Well, this is where melatonin comes in. So everything has its interrelation, its consideration as to where it is within the body and how it plays out, that I feel people may not necessarily be fully aware of. Like you mentioned, maybe hardly anyone talks about the hypothalamus. But even those who speak about the pineal, especially in circles that we're familiar with, they don't fully understand the ratio and the harmony that's required in the utility of a plant medicine, or vice versa.
Yeah, and I think this is where my inner purist goes, how far can we and should we play with these agents, right? I mean, just I can't remember, there was something else, but I mean, let's say, melatonin, or even, oh yes, the latest science, Dr. Mosconi, who talks about, estrogen and the brain. So she wrote the book, Menopause Brain. And I mean, a lot of the things that she says, are fascinating. And I love the aspect that, well, our brain is made to adapt to perimenopause and menopause, right? So there's an adaptive process, and we don't need to go into a panic. The brain adapts. But at the same time, she also talks about how during perimenopause and menopause, our brain almost looks for estrogen more than ever before. The receptors are looking for estrogen, and then science will say, okay, well, there we go. That's why we need to give women estrogen. And then I go, as the purist and sort of naturalist, I go, but why would nature, our divine design us to need something, to need a substitute, basically? Like that doesn't quite, so maybe your more scientific and masculine brain can sort of help me out there.
I thank you for acknowledging the masculine. That's a real good chip, boost to my ego. But in all honesty, to try and be balanced with the feminine and the masculine, to answer this question as authentically as possible, what we need to realize, nature affords itself a specific, how do I rephrase this? Nature affords an opportunity of life and death.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. There are certain people that have become centenarians, right, and have lived past 100 years and so on. But up until last, say, 150 years prior to that, generally people passed away predominantly before the age of 50, even earlier than that, in certain instances in centuries prior to that. There's an argument as to why this has happened, maybe lack of antibiotics and lack of modern medicine, and all of that has definitely contributed toward our opportunity of an extended lifespan. And then you have the opposing argument, which those of more of a religious, theological background may say, oh, people would live to 900 years, thousands of years ago. And this may very well be, but things have changed. And, whether or not you're a believer of Anunnaki or whether or not you're a believer of evolution, it's irrespective of the fact, the reality is that without a doubt, cancer affords itself, tumor cell cancer particularly, affords itself the opportunity after the procreative years. I want that to say to everybody. So after the years of fertility, your risk of developing cancer increases at an exorbitant rate. Why does this happen?
Yeah.
It's not. This is the greater percentile. It's not the off chance. This is the more likelihood. So why does this happen in nature? Why does nature afford us a greater opportunity to develop cancer as we get older? Possibly to manage opportunity of new life. Let's not be under any illusion. As human beings, we've altered our environment. Very few of us live in the natural setting, right? Very few of us are considered indigenous. Majority of us live in an extraterrestrial type of environment which we've created for ourselves. So with that also comes a shift in the consciousness of what it is that we expect of ourselves and of life. But yet, even though our consciousness has shifted, our physiology, for the most part, is still programmed to what nature requires of us when we are born and when we die. So when it comes to tumor cell cancers and the association that tumor cell cancers have with hormones, one could ask, why is it? And I'm going to ask you this question because maybe it might make a lot of sense for other people to get that kind of perspective, as though they were to be you. Who has a greater risk of developing breast cancer? A woman in her 50s or a girl that's 16 years old?
Definitely a woman in her 50s.
What is breast cancer mostly associated with in terms of a hormonal perspective?
Estrogen, issues with estrogen metabolizing estrogen.
Would you say it is associated with an excess of estrogen?
Yeah,
Okay, but who has more estrogen, the 16-year-old girl or the 50-year-old woman?
16-year-old girl.
So then why is it that the WHI have given us indication that estrogen causes cancer? The reality is the lack of a hormone causes the body to adapt by increasing its receptor sensitivity and proliferating the quantity of receptors in order to afford greater possibility of uptake of hormone, because there's a lack in availability of that hormone. And if the availability doesn't suffice to the demand, then what will happen is that those receptors will eventually mutate. And this is what affords the opportunity of cancer, particularly breast cancer and other forms of cancers, which most tumor cell cancers have an association to a lack or at least an imbalance of hormonal rhythm and activity, not just sex hormones, but amine hormones as well as peptide hormones throughout the body. So to answer the question that you had from a perspective of is nature not working for us? Well, it depends on what point of view you want to look at. Is it working for us to have immortal lifespans? Definitely not. Is it working for us in order to appreciate our youthful years by preventing autoimmunity? Most certainly, yes. The same immunological mechanisms that protect us from autoimmunity also make us vulnerable to cancer. I don't know if most people are aware of this.
Makes sense.
So there's a trade-off, right? And nature wants to afford the greatest opportunity when we have the greatest time to truly experience life, being that around in the sense of not talking about the human concept of what it is we are supposed to experience, not from our developed prefrontal cortex. Put that aside. Consciousness, how we've evolved it, put that aside. Natural consciousness is all about family and continuity. And nature affords us the opportunity to experience that at the utmost during the prime of our life. But when it's time to go, nature also supports that becoming the reality too. And this is something that we are, given our developed prefrontal cortex, are fighting against. But be under no illusion that anti-aging and the way in which humanity has, quote unquote, progressed is toward fighting the natural rhythms of what our design is actually meant to express.
Right.
And this is where the conflict comes in, because you have purists that want to be as closely and as harmoniously integrated with Earth, which I completely see the benefit in, from the negative ions that planet Earth gives us, to the capacity of regulating the suprachiasmatic nucleus, to having better sleep patterns and better psychology. There's so many reasons as to why a person should spend time in nature. But yet, as many reasons as there are to spend time in nature, there are so many other emotional reasons as to why a person may be motivated to combat the effects of nature. And this is the dichotomy which we find ourselves to live within, which is why it's so much more complex than just physiology, but it's very much about psychological, spiritual beliefs, right, and values.
Okay, this makes a lot of sense. This sort of it's one of those sobering thoughts and sort of sobering realities, right? To kind of like, which I feel like the last 3 years for me personally have been a continual sobering process,
Mhm.
right? Which is not
Mhm.
pleasant,
No,
but
that's really not.
it's
Self
not pleasant.
discovery of the truth is never pleasant, but it is always useful.
Yeah. So what we're saying here, I mean, in some ways, you made it very clear. It's like, yes, be a naturalist where it's appropriate.
Exactly right.
And then,
choose, choose your narrative. That's what I'm saying. Choose your narrative, right? If
right.
you want to be a full and complete, um, unbending, committed, quote unquote, naturalist, then do so with complete conviction and know that there are certain fail safes that nature may have in store for you. That being said, you might be one of the lucky few that gets to live past 100, because there are many unnatural circumstances where people didn't take hormones and live past 100, as opposed to those who did. Right. So it's not the rule, and I'm speaking from very much so from a generalized position. Yeah, statistic. I'm using my scientific knowledge mind whilst trying to also nurture my spiritual understanding of what life has an offer in the diversity of what we are as human beings. Um, so to go to what you mentioned, yes, try to find a balance into what you perceive as important, but know that whatever choice we make, we are giving up a choice of something else.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes complete sense. And so, what is your take on genomics, DNA testing? Sort of, looking at, okay, so what is our blueprint? What are our predispositions?
I think it has value. I think it has some prophylactic value. Um, I think it has value as a additional prognostic point, not as a primary prognostic point. One should never use their DNA. I don't think anyway. So you've got a lot of famous people right now vouching the use of supplements based off a DNA test. I think that is ridiculous.
Mhm.
Absolutely ridiculous. And if you understand anything about how genetics express and epigenetics, you'll also understand why that's ridiculous.
Mhm.
Um, but I do think that has value as a prophylactic tool to gauge the risk factors to a person's experience in life. But it should always be validated by some direct quantitative as well as subjective in relation to the quantitative physiological dysfunction that has been identified and the subjective or symptomatic expression that might be associated with that physiological system. It should always be objectified by that. So I
Right.
think it has value, but as a standalone, I think it falls short of precision. Truly, I do. It's the
Mhm.
probability of things happening, not the definitive um, realities of them actually occurring. It's only the
Mhm.
probability.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a blueprint that we need to work with. But then, depending on how we live epigenetically, it can either come to fruition or not.
Correct, correct. And again, it just gives further validity as to why things. If you've done your due diligence as a practitioner, or whatever, or however it is that you're helping people, and you've figured out. Let's put an example. Is struggling with chronic fatigue, and say it's a woman in her 30s. She's struggling with chronic fatigue, and she's experiencing perpetual UTIs. Okay. So you've gone through the questionnaire, and what comes up is that her small intestine is showing an issue and her thyroid is showing an issue. Then you do an organic acid survey, and you may do a thyroid survey and maybe a sex hormone survey. Comes up that she has some form of candidiasis and an accumulation of oxalates, which would definitely be contributing to the compromised methylation required in order for energy to be sustained. Furthermore, then you look into the hormones and you see, okay, actually the thyroid is working fine, but yet all the physiological systems that the thyroid is meant to regulate are down regulated. Her lipogram is showing hyperlipidemia. When you see hyperlipidemia, particularly when triglycerides are also elevated along with the cholesterol markers, 9 times out of 10, it is because of poor cellular uptake on the thyroid, as poor thyroid uptake in the mitochondrial space, without a doubt. So when you look at these scenarios and you say, okay, cool, it's candiasis, that's impacting aldehyde accumulation, which is impacting methionine synthase. Subsequently, that's impacting the regulation of deiodinase and conversion of T3, but that doesn't happen. T3 is converting fine, but because of the methionine synthase not working effectively, the antioxidant systems aren't supporting oxidation, which is causing an increase of atherosclerosis or lipoperoxidative particles to be released like LPPLA2, which is causing resistance to T3 being taken up to the mitochondrial space. So you identify all of these, and then you want validity. Why was this person so susceptible to this? And you go, oh, she had an SLA C29A2 gene expression, right? Which has a lot to do with cortisol, but also has a lot to do with folate metabolism as well. Or you look into the different, there's so many different sequences. You know, catecholamic methyltransferase. She may have a slower catecholamic methyltransferase genome expression, and a situation where you have aldehyde accumulation in the liver, it further compounds that compromise. Now she has an accumulation of unwanted estrogen metabolites, which don't, because estrogen is actually meant to support the sensitization of insulin. But if you have an unwanted accumulation of estrogen metabolites, like 4-hydroxyl as opposed to 2, then that can actually downregulate insulin sensitivity. So you'll say, oh, there's a genetic susceptibility in catecholamic methyltransferase. So what do we take from that? Okay, so do you want to give her acetylsomethionine? Well, no, we don't, because in this scenario, if we were to give her acetylsomethionine without addressing the insulin sensitivity first, the only thing that's going to come out from that is further compromised anxiety. And this is the detail, the nuances that are required to truly be able to incorporate nutrigenomics and genetic understanding into evaluation. And I don't know about you, Alex, but I've as yet come to meet many, I've met a few, but meet many doctors, let alone integrative practitioners, that actually understand how to integrate these concepts into the whole of diagnostic evaluation.
For sure.
And if you can't, don't ask a patient to spend $1,000 or $500 on a genetic test. Because if you don't understand the nuances within its use, don't waste the patient's money. You're better off taking that money and spending it on a clearly stipulated, objective, quantitative diagnostic. Because genetics are amazing, but there are so many nuances. And to truly understand its value, you need to be completely in the aware of the correlation, but also the causative effect that's impacting the expression. And epigenetics is, people speak about it loosely, but to truly understand it, it's a subject matter that can take 3 years to master in education, and not just education, but practicality of experience. And I feel that unfortunately, it's not utilized properly. Like a lot of people doing genetic tests and coming out with, I must take, this amino acid because I have insufficiency of producing dopamine. It's not just the amino acid you need. So the devil is in the detail, but not only the devil, also the angels can be in the details too. And you have to ask yourself, which is it that you wish to choose to be? Are you going to be the devil with a lack of knowledge in the detail, or an angel with the complexity and understanding?
So I want to switch our conversation briefly, sort of, because of course, I mean, we could.
Very passionate. And also very sometimes I can be misconstrued as being not abrupt, but maybe a little bit confrontational, and it's not about being confrontational. There's certain segments in the industry which I believe need to be better monitored, because people are spending money unnecessarily and not giving clear directive as to why that money was spent in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
the general public just don't have the knowledge, because they haven't
Yeah.
had the requirement to gain the knowledge to understand when somebody says, "Oh, you need to do this," and they'll give all the fluffy top level, surface level. Oh, it's because of this, and this is why it's so important. But actually, no, that's not that's just surface level. We need to understand depth, and
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, I think there's a lot of room to grow still.
Absolutely. And I think it's because so much is happening so fast. And the reality is, most doctors and practitioners out there don't even have the time, especially I feel doctors, to get the necessary sort of updated education and this holistic view of health. The reality is most doctors really, of course, there's many exceptions, but the vast majority don't understand true holistic health. They don't. They're just, what they're taught is still very, very limited compared to the overall picture of health and all the components. So, I think that's part of the problem in today's world.
I totally agree
So
with you.
yeah, sorry.
No, I totally agree with you, but I'll just add something to that. It's okay not to understand, and you don't need to understand every moving piece in order to be effective.
Yes.
But if you don't understand it, if you don't understand a moving piece, don't promote that you do, and
Mm-hmm.
definitely not promote its sale.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I wanna talk about what is the current, in your opinion. I mean, it does feel like we're sort of in a global health crisis on
Mm,
so many levels.
yeah.
And not just are we in a global health crisis, but it also which is tangible, which is real, the effects of COVID and, all of that. So the lingering effects that so many people still are experiencing, which is one thing. But it also feels like, there's this race, this global race towards optimal health. Right? Like, I mean, sometimes when I, and of course, by default, my social media feed and podcasts and everything is just filled with all of this. And I have moments where I go, when on earth did we make health and living so
Yeah.
freaking complicated?
To answer that question, so firstly, what does it actually mean to be optimal or optimized? That comes down to an individual's perspective, which is so dangerous, right? Because there isn't a standard anymore. I think what we've seen in this day and age, in this century, is we've shifted from the toxic patriarchy into the toxic matriarchy. And I truly believe that. No longer are we in the day and age where women are suppressed, but rather we're in the day and age where there isn't any structure or boundary. Now, I love the masculine and I love the feminine equally, but I understand that their value comes in their difference. And
Mm-hmm.
society as a whole, and what's going on with the global immunological health, in my opinion, and this is my opinion, partly based on some factual understanding of what I see is going on through laboratory exams, is that there's a lack of boundary, clear lack of boundary. Now, and I want to bring attention to a concept that my friend Robert Cavanaugh, and I have to give him credit for. He's a really well-renowned functional neurologist, physiotherapist, amongst just being a great guy and awesome healing capacities and capabilities. And he was writing his thesis on something very similar about the masculine and feminine when it comes to the rights within the nervous system. And the way in which he depicts it is, masculinity can almost be associated to the membrane of a cell, and femininity to its inner contents.
Mm.
Everything inside the cell creates life. and it gives the opportunity for life to be expressed. And yet the membrane allows for whatever is inside the cell to be nourished by permitting things that should go through to go through, but also ensuring that things that do not belong inside the cell do not cause poisoning inside the cell. What happens when the membrane, masculinity, is too rigid? Inner contents of the cell die, femininity dies, creation dies, and we become very much like a nationalistic culture, right? Where you have things like Nazis taking power. But what happens when the membrane is too flexible? Well, that's called cancer. And I believe that society now doesn't understand boundary. It just wants to have its opinion and express itself at the expense of other people's feelings, at the expense of other people's beliefs, and having the argument that, your beliefs do not matter as much as what I believe myself to be. You can believe whatever it is that you want to be. If you want to believe yourself to be a tree, believe yourself to be a tree. That's fine, but do not impose that continual reiteration onto somebody else, creating discomfort to what it is that they believe to be true, right? Have your say, but have your say. Do not become a tyrant in doing so, right? And unfortunately, we have lost compassion in having our say. We just want to have our say at the expense of whatever, forgetting about how it makes other people feel.
Yeah.
Okay? And we feel justified because we're almost allowing ourselves to be vindicated from past atrocities in saying, oh, I can make this statement about who I am now because in the past I was subjected to discrimination. Well, no, actually, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't. The only thing you're doing is making things worse. You're letting the vicious cycle continue. So I think when you look at like global health, it is the depiction of poor balance between masculinity and femininity. And the reason why I say that from a objective, quantitative perspective, I have a lot of people that come through with long haul COVID, or whom have long haul COVID don't even realize it and have all the signs and symptoms of autoimmunity accompanying with it. Now, what I understand COVID to do, especially the spike protein, it causes perpetual underlying vascular inflammation, which over time isn't subdued the same way in which if you were to compare a lipopolysaccharide impacting a monocyte, the monocyte would present aspects of the lipopolysaccharide to the respective lymph nodes, at which the body would create a specific immune response. This plays out for 7 days. The spike protein mutates the monocytes so that their life cycle is almost infinite in comparison. So you don't have the inflammatory response happening in a moment, you have it happening all the time. What does this do? This separates our symbiotic relationship with Earth, with the environment. So, like for example, Streptococcus actually serves a huge purpose in preventing us from heavy metal toxicity. But its excess growth can damage the basal ganglia. Okay, so there are many parasite and virus and bacteria that we harbor for the benefit of homeostasis. But we are losing capacity to be in the understanding of what that is. So now we're becoming hyper-reactive. And this is where you get the re-emergence of commensal diseases associated with things such as Epstein-Barr or Borrelia or other forms of, or even certain cases, hepatitis. Right? And diseases that had been thought to be dealt with in the past, like polio, are starting to surface as well in certain parts of the world. And the question is, why is this happening? And it's because we, as a species, due to many reasons, some of them can be construed as being conspiratorial, others more factual, but nonetheless, we've done this to ourselves. We have created a toxic assault onto our consciousness, and particularly our immunological consciousness, so that it no longer impresses on our subconscious in a beneficial way. And now we are expressing poor subconscious feminine reality, creating the outcomes such as autoimmunity, which is on the rise, more so than ever before, and particularly turbo cell cancers, which are also massively on the rise. So the solution to all of this, I believe, is to not point fingers and say, she said, he said, they did, I did. It makes me feel very bad. Is to stop doing that, firstly, because that just goes back to the old paradigm, which was not healthy either. But just try to cultivate better compassion and, very important, cooperation and not competitiveness. Biggest downfall to humanity is the fact that humanity competes with itself, doesn't help itself. And until we find out how we can help one another, truly cooperate with one another, and move away from this competitive paradigm, we will have moments of success only to be followed by moments of continual and longer lasting misery rather than euphoric moments of success. But that's my take from the metaphysical angle. From an immunological, biochemical angle, we need to fortify our innate immune system, and we need to encourage reestablishing its communicative capability and capacity with the immune system as a whole, which means we need to find out better ways to improve tolerance to stress, taking into account that technology is not going away, but we need to become more adaptable in order to handle it in a more effective way. And you can utilize certain tools like blue light blocking glasses, all that for artificial light. But apart from the physical tools, what is at our disposal today is the advancement of medical science and understanding things such as peptide bioregulators, such as full chain peptides, such as bioidentical hormonal therapies, such as immunological therapies to address senescent cells, as an example, sensolytics. Therapies to reinstigate mitochondrial DNA replication. But in order to truly have all these beautiful tools in full disposal, we need to become more intimate with what it is that our bodies are actually doing, which means not looking into things in a specialist perspective, i.e., not just being a gastroenterologist, not just being an endocrinologist, not just being a rheumatologist, but actually going back to how medicine was performed during its inception, which is actually through a philosophical mindset, not just a logical mindset, although philosophy is construed as logic to a certain degree. But having the philosophical mind will bring back how medicine should be performed. And at that point, we can utilize these tools that are rightly available for us to use to the betterment of improving the innate immune system's capacity to communicate with the entirety of the immune system as well, the adaptive and other components within the innate itself. But that's what I believe needs to happen. And subsequently, hopefully, the idea of cooperation and compassion will be birthed from a different mindset rather than just of words and just of moments of meditation. Not to say that those are not justified or don't have power, meaning, everything's, to start creation starts with a word. So there's a lot of power and meaning, but there needs to be more follow through. What do they really mean? There's one thing to say that you have a lot of respect for people. There's another thing to say you have enough respect for somebody to go out of your way and help them build their own home because they have come from a disadvantageous background. Action affords the reality. Words are just the first step, but you got to follow through, and we need more follow through. Right now, we have a lot of people with opinion. This media is all about opinion and not about fact anymore. And we need to move away from that and actually start to develop righteous facts. Not self-righteous, righteous facts, which is very different. That's what I think.
Wow, no, that was a beautiful explanation, and as I'm listening to this, all I can say, especially for the listeners, the world is especially the world of social media is pretty much dominated by still the West, right? America, Europe. And to me, being a European and having lived in America, knowing intimately those cultures, and this is just kind of like pure raw stuff that's coming up for me as I'm listening to you. So yes, it's not politically correct. I'm not politically correct. I'm not any of those things. I'm just listening to this and going, people in the West we need to start shifting out of the thinking that we are superior.
Yeah.
Because that, to me, that is the biggest poison. And, I know when I moved to South Africa and I started meeting South Africans. In fact, I was meeting South Africans before I moved to South Africa because I was living in Tuscany on a wine farm and serving a lot of South Africans. And what always genuinely struck me, like just really struck me, was, oh my gosh, these South Africans have a very different way of thinking and of being in the world. And I have to say, once again, listening to you, it's like I have such a deep appreciation for South Africans because there is a connectedness to, and I know that I was transmitted that. I was transmitted that by living in South Africa. Nothing has healed my being more than being on South African land. And so listening to you speak is like, man, this is the stuff that people need to start hearing. Because yes, we are on the frickin' way of absolute destruction. And I see this.
Our country has had a very difficult history because of outside influence. Back being a white South African, my ancestors, for the most part, were racist. And unfortunately, same as it must have been and may still be in certain aspects, it was the same in Germany. Influenced by outside factors that were not true to themselves, but because of fear, indoctrinated with a superiority complex in order to survive, or in order to live up the perception in the need of survival to do so, because it was just a perception, it was never really a reality. And a lot of us South Africans, particularly from my generation, I was born in '86, so right before apartheid ended, I was birthed into the cusp of the shift that was going on. And a lot of my generation that followed, have had to dramatically and radically undo lineal curses, lineal influence of separatism, which was first actually conjured by the British after the Boer War in order to separate the Afrikaner from the local Africans, because they actually were congregating and working land together, and they created quite a opposition or contending opposition to the imperial rule. Subsequently, that thought process was indoctrinated and superiority complexes were produced, and then the Afrikaans adopted it by an outside influence with somebody that was never even from South Africa. It was a Dutchman from Holland, wasn't even Afrikaner, that came up with the concept. But unfortunately, we created for it to be our own for a good period of 50, 60 years before it all changed. But as radical as it had come into fruition, I could safely say, for the most part, as South Africans, we have done away with racism. And if I look at America, in contrast, who has had quote unquote equality for a lot longer than what we've had, the times that I've been there to visit, I have confronted many a moment of racism, subtle as it may be, nonetheless still apparent, especially when you come from a country like South Africa and you can see between the lines very, very clearly. And this brings me to the point about two South Africans that I admire. One is past Nelson Mandela, and the other Elon Musk, and two opposite ends of the, should we say, the yin to the yang of what South Africa is really made of. And I look at one aspect, and I'm busy reading, I'm just about to finish actually Nelson Mandela's autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, and just the incredible journey that this man took, literally from the most humble beginnings, without electricity, without a toilet at your disposal, literally the most humble of beginnings, to rise up against a tyrannical idea at all the expense of self-preservation, to finally come to the point of faith in humanity. Because if it was not for his faith in humanity, on his release, he could have very well have instigated a civil war, which would have been a bloodbath.
Oh, yeah.
And many a children, many a family would have died. But he had such faith in humanity because he understood what cooperation is. And I say is, not was, because I want for it to live in the present, not in the past.
Absolutely. I agree.
And then I look at Elon Musk and I see the adversity. He was a white man that came into America or Canada initially, right after apartheid had ended. So you can imagine the contention that a white person would have been met with going into the first world countries that put sanctions on South Africa for the very reason of him being white and imposing race. Well, them having the perception that he was the personification of racial suppression. Meanwhile, there are many white people, a person that didn't want apartheid, but were in such fear of speaking out that they also didn't have the courage. Unfortunately, not everybody is a Nelson Mandela, as much as they would want to be, black and white. Nonetheless, Elon Musk going in Canada, overcoming so much, and I have no doubt he was met with some form of prejudice. Absolutely, during that time of history, I mean,
For sure.
the whole world was looking at us, right? And yet, with all of that, he maintained focus on his dream and his goal. And reading the book by Walter Isaacson on his life, he's rather tyrannical in the way in which he runs his companies. But the reason as to why he has such unbending authority in the way in which he runs his companies is because he has such conviction in why he does what he's doing. And I look at these two individuals, and it makes me proud, completely proud to be born in this country and come from this land. And there is something very unique about this country, is that as deprived as certain regions are, there's always some flicker of opportunity here. And I've been to many other countries. I haven't been to all the countries, but I haven't been to any other country where I could safely say that if you have enough conviction in yourself, some kind of magic happens that affords for things to be aligned for your success.
Yeah.
It's a land of true capacity of manifestation. It's just got an energy, very raw and unique. But thank you for acknowledging that in our country as well. I appreciate it. It's nice to have an outsider say something positive, particularly when a lot of our brethren are still going through the growth and becoming what it is that they can be, and with that, still witnessing the shadow of scarcity and not realizing the opportunity because the shadow is blinding their light. So I hope that some South Africans listen to the podcast and gain some perspective in the opportunity that lies in our country. I think if more of us stood together in cooperation, it would be a far greater opportunity, more so than we ever could have dreamed of, to be honest.
Well, it's why I want to come back, and why I feel, I mean, it's I had that feeling when I first arrived, and for many years, and it was like, this country has so much, and I feel there's something very special there for the times that we're living in right now. So, yeah, well, what a beautiful, colorful conversation this was. There was so much, and in many ways it it really reflects once again also my belief of how deep the discussion around health really goes, that health is not just about nutrition or testing, or it's really, to me, it's how are we living, with what kind of understanding are we living, and that true health is really about a deep sobering up on all levels.
That word,
right?
I love that word, sobriety. And what it really means. Like, it's got for me, it's got a lot of emotional depth. Having been an addict in my previous life, sobriety has a very, very deep emotional resonance. And it's to truly be sober in the world in which we live in requires continual rehabilitation.
It does, yeah. I mean, likewise, I always say 35 years of an eating disorder. I could have been a heroin addict. So, it's like it doesn't matter. Like an addiction is an addiction. It's an addiction for me is about the inability, not the refusal, the inability to be present with the sobering truth.
Correct. It is
Right?
I'm so glad you put that there as not a refusal. It's got nothing to do with willpower. It has all to do with the inability, the not
Yeah.
knowing what to do,
Yeah.
regardless of how hard you try.
Absolutely.
Inability, unable.
Yeah. Due to deep disconnection. Ultimately disconnection from source, which then leads to the splintering, the disassociation from reality, because it's just like we cannot cope. And to me, the real picture of health is how deeply can I cope with all of reality, right? Everything that is real, that is true, which is not all, as we said, it's not all ideal and pleasant.
Interestingly, I think it's quite ironically contradictive, the word inability. Okay, because what you mentioned right now, not being able to cope with what's going on around us, requires us to go inward in order to be able to gain the capacity to cope. So I think it's the word. I just thought about it in this moment right now. But the word inability is so ironically contradictive.
It is. It is.
Ability, it's your inner ability that you should have capacity to. It should be called unability, unable.
Mm-hmm.
Or
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think it's there are other words such as emotion, right? Like I think this is probably more popular now, but energy and motion, emotion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is the subtleties of what it is that we profess. And being wholly present in the moment allows us to bear witness to that really makes us powerful. Bringing it back to what you mentioned, to being wholly present and connected with Source, the Absolute, God, Krishna, Buddha, Christ, whatever label, the labels
Yeah.
mean. Language is just a series of labels, but labels have power if they have value behind what they actually mean. And I think that's something that also may need some kind of adjustment, and it's becoming more wholly present in what it is we choose to share and how it is that we choose to share. I'm going off on a tangent now. Now you're getting the metaphysical side of me coming out, and this really go down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, I like those rabbit holes too. So okay, so we'll stop it here. And so Justin, where do people find you? If people want to get in touch with you, where do they best find you?
Well, apart from the ether, in moments such as these, they can reach out to me on my Instagram account. I'm never on it, by the way. I've got a team that manage it. I just record interesting educational things. I'm actually not, and I watch other educational Instagram when they get sent to me on a WhatsApp. But if you message me on there, my team will let me know, which is autonomic_coaching. Or if you want more of an intimate exchange, you can always email me, old school email, like who uses email anymore?
Yeah.
Justin at autonomiccoaching.com. And the C is, there's two C's, right? So I haven't joined the C. So it's autonomic. And then there's another C for coaching. Just to, everyone assumes that you're going to, be very cool. I'm not cool. I'm not trendy. I'm very to the point when it comes to things like that. And then start a dialogue and see what we can come up with together.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for this amazing conversation. So grateful for your time, and yeah, we'll definitely have you on again. Thank you everyone for listening. Hope you enjoy this episode and that you share our episodes when they inspire you. Sending you all my love.
Thanks, Alex.